Start recording whenever you are ready.
We are recording now.
Excellent. So my name is Melissa Welch, and I am the youth advocate here at the ARC of Larimer County. I've been here for about 2 years, and we are going to talk today about IEPs. And so the goal of this workshop is that you walk away from this workshop with more knowledge than you started with. This workshop is usually geared towards parents and caregivers, but it's also very important information for other professionals to be able to share with the parents and caregivers that they support and work with. And one of the things that I really strive for in this job is to make sure that folks feel empowered to navigate and participate in the IEP process. It can be overwhelming, it can be confusing, and that's what I'm here for as an advocate. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. But I want to make sure that the families that I work with eventually feel like they are able to advocate for the children and youth that they work with themselves, that they have the tools necessary. And so part of that is making sure that folks know what resources are available here in our community in Larimer County to help you if you are struggling through this IEP process. And so today I'm gonna introduce the ARC of Larimer County a little bit and let you know what we do here. We do much more than just educational advocacy. We're gonna talk about the IEP process. We're gonna talk about how an IEP is different than a 504 plan. Some of my tips for what I consider sort of essentials for a good IEP and a good IEP meeting. And then again, those resources for who you can connect with here in the community if you need additional assistance. So we here at the ARC of Larimer County, we are a nonprofit organization and we are funded by the ARC thrift stores. So when you shop at the ARC thrift store or donate to the ARC thrift store, you are supporting our efforts and you are supporting our ability to provide our services free of charge. So nobody will ever pay anything for participating or using advocacy services here at the ARC of Larimer County. And we serve individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities from birth through death. So cradle to grave agency. And we focus on individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that's a very broad umbrella. That might include things like cerebral palsy, autism, ADHD, and a number of other diagnoses. When it comes to educational advocacy, we serve 3 school districts: the Poudre School District, the Thompson School District, and the Estes Park School District. So any student who is receiving public education in Larimer County, any student with disabilities in Larimer County. And again, our services are free of charge, and they're really tailored to meet our clients' specific needs and goals. So as a youth advocate, I work very closely with parents and other caregivers. I also work very closely with a lot of DHS case managers to work with youth who are in the foster system. I also work in the criminal justice system to make sure that youths are appropriately identified as individuals with disabilities and are receiving the appropriate services rather than penalization or punishment. And so, like I said, our services are really geared towards our clients and their specific needs. I always say we are the GPS, but ultimately you are still driving the car. And so you tell us where you want to go and we help you get there. So an IEP. An IEP is an individual education program, and we will be using IEP and special education interchangeably because what we're talking about is special education services and instruction in general. And the way that that special education is delivered is through an IEP, or an individual education program. And so every student who receives special education needs to have this IEP, because it really is the roadmap to our educational goals. So the purposes of an IEP are to set reasonable goals for the student and to state the services that the school district will provide to that student. And so the IEP is developed by an IEP team. And we'll get to who that includes in a minute. So one of the biggest questions that I get asked as an advocate is, how do I get started? I suspect that my child has a disability, or not even suspect, we have a diagnosis from a pediatrician, from a mental health practitioner, but we have a medical diagnosis, or we're pursuing a medical diagnosis, but we suspect there's some kind of a disability. We suspect there's a need for some additional supports at school. How do we start the process? So the process starts with that suspicion of disability. And we're going to talk more in a few minutes about the difference between medical diagnoses and educational eligibility. But the fact remains, this process starts when we suspect that there is something going on that is interfering with a child's ability to learn, or creating obstacles for a child to access their educational environment. And so once we have that suspicion, we request an assessment, and we want to do that in writing. And I'm going to show you a sample of that in a few slides. Once that assessment is requested, then the school district has two options. One is they can evaluate the student for special education, or they can deny evaluation. And if they deny that evaluation, they have to provide ample evidence supporting their position for why an evaluation is not necessary, or why they don't suspect that this student's disabilities are interfering with their ability to learn. But if the student is evaluated, then we go through the evaluation process and we determine if they are eligible for special education services. And once we make that determination, that's when the IEP process starts. That's when we start building the IEP. So the first step in all of this is requesting an assessment. And so a number of people can request a special education evaluation. Parents and caregivers, the school district, if, for example, the classroom teacher suspects that the student maybe needs a little bit more support than general education can provide, or the state education agency or other state agency. And so what that means is whomever holds educational rights to the child. So if that's a parent, a grandparent, an aunt or an uncle, a guardian ad litem, a foster parent, whoever has educational decision-making rights for a student can request an evaluation. And whoever has those rights has to give consent in writing before the evaluation can take place. So, for example, if the school district suspects that there is a disability and they are the ones who begin the process by requesting an assessment, the parent or caregiver still has to give consent for that assessment to happen. And so nothing happens in terms of assessment until that educational decision-making holder gives written consent. So that's really important because, again, like I said, these things can be very complicated and very confusing. And sometimes parents will say to me, I don't know if we've started the evaluation process or not. We've talked about a lot of things, but I don't know if that's actually what we're doing. And so a good rule of thumb that I always tell the families I work with is if you haven't signed something in writing, the evaluation process hasn't started. And so once we have that written consent, then the evaluation has to be completed within 60 calendar days of written consent. Okay. And depending on what is being evaluated, there's several different categories. We have social and emotional, we have behavioral concerns, physical, learning disabilities, cognitive concerns. So depending on what areas are being evaluated, a team might use that entire 60 days to complete the evaluation. And that's a good thing because we really want them to collect as much robust data as they can across a number of different environments, when kiddos are having good days and bad days, and things like that. So the evaluation has to be completed within 60 calendar days. And the evaluation needs to cover all areas related to the suspected disability. So like I said, if we have a kiddo with ADHD, we might see someone who has concerns with learning, but also social emotional concerns, behavioral concerns. And so we want to make sure that we're not looking at just one of those areas, but we're evaluating all of the pieces together so that we have a really comprehensive picture of the student. And likewise, we don't want to evaluate a student in areas that we don't have concerns for. So this is a sample request letter for an evaluation, and this will be available on our website along with this recording. But the basic pieces that you want to have in your IEP request is you want to let them know, number one, what are you concerned about? You know, again, if we keep using this ADHD example, I'm concerned that my student or my child has a difficult time completing tasks, starting tasks, staying on task, understanding complex directions, remaining seated, or again, you know, staying on task. I'm concerned that they are not interacting with their peers at school. Again, whatever it is that your concern is, I'm concerned that their grades are very low. I'm concerned that they seem behind their peers. And then the next piece is you're going to talk about the interventions or the steps that you have already taken to try and help this student or this child. That might include a 504 plan if you already have one of those in place, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. It might include just general universal supports that are available to everybody in the classroom. This might include outside interventions from a private occupational therapist or a private behavioral therapist, as well as things that you as the parent or caregiver are doing to support the child at home as well, such as one-to-one direct assistance with homework, or setting constant reminders, or breaking directions down into a smaller piece, right? Oftentimes we see, even before an IEP is in place, we have already tried some solutions to help this child access their education. And then the last piece of your request is that explicitly stating that you are giving your written permission to be evaluated and providing your contact information, and that's it. And then you're going to want to send this to your child's classroom teacher, school principal, district representative, if that's appropriate. And you can also include anybody outside of the school district that you're working with as well. For example, an advocate, a lawyer, an outside occupational therapist, anybody that you want to have involved in the process. this seems like a good place to stop and ask, are there any questions thus far?
And Melissa, just FYI, there's none in the chat so far.
Great.
And we had somebody else join us after you started.
I saw that. Thank you. All right. Well, we'll keep trucking. So, like I said before, there is a difference between a medical diagnosis of a disability and an educational eligibility. When we are talking about a child's disability in the school setting, we are talking about how this disability impacts their ability to access their education. And so, again, kids with ADHD, kids with autism, kids with anxiety, they may have medical diagnoses for these conditions. However, that does not necessarily automatically mean that they are experiencing educational barriers because of these disabilities. So in other words, a medical diagnosis does not automatically equal educational eligibility. And that's the purpose of this evaluation, is we're saying, what are the concerns or the struggles or the barriers that are in place for this student in an academic or educational setting, okay? And it's very often that we don't necessarily see the same concerns at home and at school, okay? We tend to see one of two things. Either kids do really, really well at home, and then they really, really struggle when they get to school, or we see the opposite, where kids are really, really struggling at home, but they do really well when they go to school. And that can be really frustrating for parents because they feel like they need additional help, right? But sometimes what we see is kids are using all of their tools and their coping mechanisms and their skills in order to kind of keep it together during the day at school. And then when they come home to their safe place, they kind of let loose. I know I've certainly experienced that with my own child. So I really hammer this point home because it's really important to understand that when we are doing an evaluation for special education, we are evaluating in the educational context only, okay? Is this child experiencing barriers to their education as a result of their disability? And so there are 13 different disability categories that kids can qualify for special education services under. And those are listed here: autism spectrum disorder, deaf blindness, developmental delay, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, serious emotional disability, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment. And so one of the things that's important to know about disability categories is that particular interventions and services are not tied to disability categories. In other words, if a student qualifies under autism spectrum disorder, that doesn't mean that we automatically assign these interventions or access to these services. But we don't give you access to these services if you qualify under other health impairment. The way that it works, again, is we're really using that evaluation to drive our understanding of what this child's needs are, how to best categorize those needs, and then how to best meet those needs. But the interventions and the goals and the related services are all being derived from that evaluation data, not from the disability category that the child is eligible under itself. Does that make sense? I said, does that make sense, as though I can see you nodding along with me. But it's really important because a lot of times, especially with autism spectrum disorder, we'll see kids that qualify for special education services, but maybe not under autism spectrum disorder. And parents are really concerned. Does that mean that they're not going to get X or Y or Z intervention? Should we push for them to be recognized under autism spectrum disorder? And again, these are categories that have been set by the Department of Education, and they're not perfect, but we're less concerned with what they qualify under than just making sure that they qualify. So again, medical diagnosis and educational eligibility are two different things. And educational eligibility does not negate a medical diagnosis. So again, if a student receives an outside diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, but they are not found eligible under the autism spectrum disorder category, that doesn't mean that the school doesn't think the student has autism. It simply means that's not the best fit for them to qualify for special education services. And so I always like to let parents and caregivers know that we can put those specific diagnoses in a section of the IEP called the parent input section, so that there is still a record and a knowledge of what the official diagnoses are. But again, when we're looking at developing an IEP, we're really looking at what are those needs and what is the impact of the student's disability on their education, on their ability to access general education. So this also includes extracurricular and non-academic activities. For example, socialization with peers, the ability to access after-school clubs, or things like that. So again, we're looking at a really holistic picture of the entire student. And so this student needs and impact of disability is a statement that's written in the IEP. And again, it's really being driven by the evaluation data. So it's telling us, we found out in this evaluation that these are the areas of concern for this student related to their ability to access education. And so when we're talking about developing the IEP, it's important to know who is part of that, who is on the IEP team. And so the first member is the student's parents, or like I said, caregivers, guardians ad litem, whoever has educational decision-making rights. We need to make sure there's at least one general education teacher, at least one special education teacher, a representative from the school district. That doesn't have to be somebody different than one of the teachers, and someone who can interpret the instructional implication of the evaluation results. So this one's really important. So again, if we have concerns about a student's ability to use expressive and receptive language, communicating how they're thinking and feeling and understanding how other people are thinking and feeling, we want to make sure that someone who is qualified to interpret those difficulties is number one, doing and gathering the evaluation data, and number two, part of the interpretation telling us this is how the disability specifically impacts their education. And so that person in that example would be a speech language pathologist, right? Somebody who understands and can interpret the results of evaluating a student's use of speech and language. Same thing goes for occupational therapists, physical therapists, behavioral therapists, mental health practitioners, right? We want to have these specialists involved in the evaluation process, and we want them at the table when we're developing the IEP so that they can tell us how this evaluation data translates into the classroom, and not just into the classroom, but translates into our services and accommodations and goals for the student. So those are the people that we have to have in the room. However, you are also welcome to invite anybody else that you might be working with. Again, if you're working with an outside behavioral therapist or an outside occupational therapist, mental health practitioner, if you're involved with the county with DHS and you've got a caseworker, if you're involved with a CCB, a community centered board, and you have a case manager there that you think would be appropriate to come, you are welcome to invite anybody else who you think has knowledge or expertise regarding your child and the related services. And of course, that also includes us as advocates. And then whenever appropriate, of course, the student themselves should be involved in the IEP team and determining what they need to be successful. Now, typically, middle school is about the age that I find kids really start to understand and be able to take some responsibility for understanding what their accommodations are and things like that. Before middle school, it's a really long meeting to sit through for most kids. And so sometimes parents and teachers will have kids come to the very beginning of an IEP meeting where we talk about all of the students' strengths and the progress and the growth that they've made so that the student can feel supported and share anything that they think is important for the team to know. And then we'll dismiss them to go back to class or lunch or recess, which they certainly don't want to be missing to sit in a room full of adults. So it's important to know that all chairs have to be full for the entire meeting. So what that means is in order for us to have an IEP meeting, we need to have all of those representatives that we just talked about: a general education teacher, a special education teacher, related service providers, if your student is receiving related services such as OT, PT, speech, behavior services, a parent or whoever the student's legal guardian is, and if appropriate, the student themselves. And so if we are missing one of those key players, we do not hold the meeting, okay? Everybody needs to be there in order to make decisions about or changes to the IEP. The other thing that's important to know is that they need to be there for the whole meeting. If somebody starts the meeting with you, they need to finish the meeting with you. And so sometimes folks will say, I can only be here for about 15 minutes and then I have to hop to another meeting. And I like to let parents know that they have the right to approve that or not. If an IEP team member needs to be excused for the meeting or part of the meeting, there needs to be an agreement between the school district and the parent in writing that that parent gives consent for that person to be absent from the meeting. And there are certainly times where it's appropriate. I've been in lots of meetings where the adaptive PE coach has come for the first half of the meeting to discuss the progress that the student is making in that area of the IEP, and to talk about goals and accommodations relating to his piece of things. And then he leaves because we recognize that related service providers often have many IEP meetings that they need to attend to. And so it's okay if they're not able to be there for the whole thing, as long as you agree to it. And so I really like to, and again, these were the norms for pre-COVID, but also as we're conducting IEP meetings through virtual platforms as well, I like to start off the meetings by saying, this meeting has been scheduled for an hour and a half, however long we've scheduled it for. Is everybody able to stay for that entire time? Or should we take a few minutes here at the beginning of the meeting to look at our calendars and determine when we need to schedule a continuance? Okay, so I like to set the norms that we have set aside X amount of time for this student, for this family, and we are all going to honor that and be present here during that time for this student. So if somebody starts the IEP process with you, they need to finish the IEP process with you. They need to stay for the entire length of the meeting, unless you as the parent and caregiver have had the opportunity to agree to their absence in writing. So now on to the components of an IEP. And I'm not going to go over each one of these components in detail, although I would be happy to answer any questions about them after the presentation or in an individual consultation. So the pieces of the IEP, we've got present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. So if we are starting off with a brand new IEP, this is our first meeting after the evaluation, those present levels of academic achievements and functional performance are going to come, you guessed it, straight from the evaluation report, literally copied and pasted from the evaluation that we just conducted. And that lets us know, what is our baseline? What is our starting point? If this is an annual IEP, one that's already been in place and we're just reviewing, this will probably include current grades, current standardized testing, and things like that. So again, where are we at this point in time? And we also want to discuss how this student's disability affects their involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. So again, that's that student needs and impact of disability statement. That's right there at the beginning of the IEP, and it serves as a great touchstone for developing the rest of the IEP. So we want to make sure that that student need and impact of disability statement is really robust and covers all of the students' related needs in the educational environment. The IEP also has annual goals, as well as how we're going to measure them, how the data is going to be collected, what the goals are, and then any related services that are going to be provided. So like I said before, do we have an OT available, a PT? Do we have behavioral interventions, speech language pathologists? We're going to talk about the accommodations and modifications, if there are any, to the curriculum. We're going to talk about how much time this student spends with their typically developing peers. So how much time are they in general education versus how much time are they pulled out of general education? How they participate in state and district-wide assessments. And then a service delivery statement. So again, this is that summary of here's when these services are starting, here's how often they will be delivered, the location. Again, are they happening, are they push-in services where a service provider is going into the general education classroom and working with the student in that environment? Or are they pull-out services where the student is going to a different location to receive those interventions? Both of those have their place and are important parts of determining the least restrictive environment for the student to learn in. We always want the student to be in the least restrictive environment possible. And that, what the least restrictive environment is for a student depends on the individual student themselves and what their needs are. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all in terms of determining that least restrictive environment. And then we also have transition services as part of the IEP. And we want to start talking about those no later than the age of 14. And that is giving us an idea of where this student sees themselves going after high school. Are they looking to be employed? Are they looking to go on to higher education? What kinds of jobs or skills are they interested in? And a lot of parents and caregivers will say to me, well, I don't think my child knows what they want to do after high school. And I understand that, especially as somebody who currently has a 14-year-old whose passions change on the daily. And so this isn't necessarily something that's set in stone. In general, the entire IEP is a living document that is intended to change with the students' needs and abilities and so forth. But we really want to think, starting with 14, we really want to think of what is coming next for this student and how are we preparing them for life after high school. And so what that means is from the age of 14 on, that IEP is going to be driven by those transition goals. So if we are working on functional communication for a student, we are creating functional communication goals for a student so that they are able to work as a coffee shop barista after high school. Right? That's their goal. Their goal is to be able to be employed at a coffee shop or a restaurant because they really love that social interaction piece of employment. And so that's a really good fit for them. Does that mean that we're putting them in a box that working as a coffee shop barista is the only thing that we're preparing them to do after high school? Absolutely not. But it means that on the first day of the rest of their lives after high school, their IEP should have prepared them for whatever comes next. So that's what the transition services aims to do. So accommodations and modifications are a really important component of the IEP, and it's what sets an IEP apart from a 504 plan. And we're going to talk about the difference between a 504 and an IEP in the next slide. So accommodations change how the content is taught. They are supportive techniques that are intended to level the playing field and help a student access the curriculum. But it does not change the instructional level, content, or criteria for meeting a standard. So accommodations look like things like frequent breaks, access to noise-canceling headphones, which in this day and age is becoming more and more of a universal support that's offered to all students. Access to noise-canceling headphones, preferential seating, making sure that the student is sat somewhere in the classroom that they are going to be most successful. So that might be close to the front of the room if the student has vision impairment, or it might be towards the back of the room if that's the best place for the student to sit, or close to the teacher so that they can be supported. Accommodations might also include things like adaptive scissors or adaptive writing instruments, assistive technology, speech to text, extended time on assignments, breaking instructions down into smaller chunks. These are all examples of accommodations, right? They're changing how the student accesses the content. They're not changing the content themselves. Modifications do change what is taught. So a modification is a change in what the student is expected to learn or demonstrate. So a student might be working on modified course content, but the subject area remains the same. So for example, if an English class is reading Romeo and Juliet, a modification might be to find a copy of Romeo and Juliet that is appropriate for that student's abilities. So it might not be the exact same book that the rest of the class is reading, but the content is still, the content area or the subject area is still the same. So if students are in biology and learning about the life cycle, right? The student is still going to be included in that general education environment as much as possible and participating in that same curriculum, just modified to reach their ability level. What this means is if a student is receiving modifications to the curriculum, it does fundamentally alter the expectations or the standards for performance criteria. And that means that we are altering their degree expectations. We are no longer graduating this student with a general education diploma. Instead, we are graduating this student with some sort of an educational certificate. And so typically we only see modifications for students with considerable intellectual or developmental disabilities. And when we do change that outcome, we are also changing the opportunities that they are eligible for post-high school. There are, in Colorado, particularly a number of higher education opportunities for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They are 4-year, 2-year, or 4-year? I want to say 4-year programs that are fully supported on campus, and students come away from those with a certificate of some sort. So again, it's not a college degree, a BA, a BS, something like that, but it is a program certification. And those programs that are offered differ from program to program. But the most important thing to remember about accommodations and modifications is that accommodations are changing how the content is taught. Modifications is changing what is taught, okay? And we can only modify curriculum for a student with an IEP. And so that brings us to the differences between 504 plans and IEPs. And let's see if I'm able to share what I'm trying to share. Okay. Okay, are you still able to see what's on my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so you see this 504 versus IEP infographic.
Yep.
Perfect. This, like I said, just like the other letter that I've shown, this will be available on our website as well. And I'm not going to go over it because it is pretty extensive, but the difference between a 504 and an IEP really comes down to these specialized instruction and related services that a student is receiving. Students who have 504 plans are, in essence, receiving accommodations for their disabilities, and that's it. They are not receiving special education from a special education teacher. They are not receiving support they are not receiving the same kind of support from occupational therapists, speech language therapists, behavioral therapists, etc. Okay, so a 504 plan let's come down to here. The eligibility for a 504 plan is a student has to have a disability, and the disability has to affect the student's ability to access the curriculum. So similar to an IEP, where a student has to qualify for one of those 13 eligibility categories. However, a 504 does not require a written plan. It does not follow the same kind of evaluation procedures, and it does not offer the same kind of customized curriculum that an IEP offers. There is not the same kind of target goals or progress monitoring. It really comes down to the student being given access to accommodations like we talked about before. So extended time on assignments or extensions on due dates, noise canceling headphones, access to jewelry, the things that the necklaces and things like that that you can chew on. But that's it, okay? They don't receive those extra services. And so sometimes we will see when we submit that request for an IEP in writing, we might sometimes see the school team come back and say, we're not sure if an IEP is appropriate. We'd like to start with a 504. We'd like to start with these accommodations and see if that is sufficient. And if it's not, we will proceed to an IEP. And if it is, then that's where the process ends. Oh my goodness, why am I not able to bring this back up? Okay. Have I brought us back to the slideshow?
Yes. We can see
Okay,
it.
excellent. So, like I said before, really the difference between this 504 and an IEP really comes down to, does the student need accommodations and accommodations alone, or does a student need those supported services and specialized instruction in order to know how to use the accommodations? That's one thing that I often talk with parents and school teams about. Is it's one thing to have a toolkit, it's another thing to know how to use it. And so oftentimes if we find that accommodations on their own, a 504 plan on its own, is not as effective as we would like, we probably need to look at additional support from an IEP, because we need students to learn how to use these tools. So when it comes to an IEP meeting and preparing for an IEP meeting, be prepared. This is one of the things that I walk through with the families that I support, is preparing for an IEP meeting, and of course attending the meeting as well if that's something that the parent or caregiver would like. But in order to prepare, have you asked your child for their input? What do they think is going well? What are they struggling with? Like I said, if they are old enough to really understand their accommodations, what do they find useful? Are there accommodations on there that they don't use at all? Because let's not keep using them if the student themselves doesn't find them helpful. Have you asked for a draft IEP, and have you reviewed it? The school team should be able to provide you with a draft of that IEP. in advance of the meeting. Typically, I like to ask for it at least 4 or 5 days before the meeting so that the family or caregivers have a chance, number one, to review it themselves, and number two, an opportunity to review that IEP draft with other outside service providers, an advocate, with their child. And again, a draft IEP, because an IEP is a collaborative effort between members of the school team and parents and caregivers, your draft IEP might be pretty bare bones because they don't want to pre-generate goals or things like that without having a discussion about them. Other times, an IEP team might say, we've put some draft goals in to see if we're on the right track, and we'll talk more about finessing them in the meeting. So that draft IEP is going to look a little bit different based on your relationship with the IEP team. But the point of getting that draft IEP ahead of time is you want to have the same opportunity as everybody else to review the material and be on the same page as the rest of the team when you walk into that meeting. One of the things that I hear from parents and caregivers most often is it feels really one-sided. I don't know what I should be looking for or what I should be asking for, or if my child is even getting all of the things that they are entitled to. And again, I don't think that that concern necessarily comes from any ill intent from the school. I think it's simply the imbalance of power that we have here. Typically, IEP meetings, we have 4 or 5 people from a school team and maybe one parent by themselves. And that can feel overwhelming and disempowering. And so one of the best things that we can do is show up as an equal member of the IEP team, having done the prep work ahead of time. Do the child's private supports need to provide input? Oftentimes, school teams are eager to collaborate with the child's outside providers. If a child is receiving outside occupational therapy or outside speech therapy, the school therapist would love to hear what's going on and what you're working on outside of school, so that again, there can be this wraparound support for the student, that we're not asking them to try and work on conflicting goals in and out of school. But similarly, that we're not providing the exact same interventions over and over again. And so you are welcome to invite those outside providers to the IEP meeting. If they're not able to attend, oftentimes they might want to write a progress update or some sort of a summary about what they've been working on and what the child's progress has been. And like I said, other times they might want to come to the meeting themselves. And again, bringing outside folks, advocates, therapists, etc., to a meeting is not just about how they support the child, but also how they support the parent and the caregiver. Again, sometimes it just feels good to have another person sitting there with you who is also listening to this information, maybe taking notes for you so that you can go back and look at them later. I know sometimes I walk out of a meeting and I go, I don't even remember what we just talked about. So to have that extra set of eyes and ears there sometimes is comforting and empowering for parents. So we're not just thinking about who does the student need in order for this to be a successful and productive meeting, but also what kind of support does the parent or the caregiver require as well. And then last but not least, do you know who's coming to the meeting? Like I said, we have a basic list of who has to be there, but sometimes, especially if this is a more complicated IEP or if there is some contention or disagreements, we might see individuals from the administrative level of the district might participate or be involved. But you will receive a notice of meeting prior to the IEP meeting, and that will list everybody who is coming to that meeting. So you will know when you walk in there, you should expect to see the occupational therapist, the speech language pathologist, the school principal, et cetera, and so forth. So preparing for the meeting is half the battle so that you feel like you're walking in there having had the time to review information ahead of time. You're not being surprised by anything, and you feel like you have the support you need to really understand and participate in this process. And so my essentials for a successful IEP seem simple, but they really are the foundations for a lasting, productive relationship with your child's school team. And that comes down to trust, respect, and communication. Trust that everybody who is present has your child's best interest in mind. We are typically always all at the table for this student because we all want to see them succeed. We want to see them have the best experience possible with the best level of support that is appropriate for them. One thing that I hear often from parents is that they don't feel like their student is receiving enough support. And schools have just as much of a responsibility to make sure that they are not over supporting a student as they do to make sure that they are not under supporting a student. So we never want to put a student in a situation where we're taking away from their agency or their autonomy or their ability to do things because we're providing too much support. And so that brings me to my next point of respect. It's really important that we respect each other's expertise. When parents come to work with me, I am always upfront and let them know that I am not an occupational therapist. I'm not a speech language pathologist. I'm not a behavioral therapist. I'm not a special education teacher. And so I do not have the authority or the knowledge to override somebody else's expertise of a situation. So if an occupational therapist recommends a particular accommodation, I am trusting and respecting that person's specialized knowledge, that they are suggesting and providing the best and most appropriate intervention, support, accommodation for this student. And likewise, that respect goes all ways. As parents and caregivers, you often know your children better than anybody. And so your perspective, your knowledge, and your opinions are just as important as everybody else who is part of this team. And that brings me to my last point of communication, which is, again, if we assume that everybody at the table has the student's best interest in mind, that opens us up to be able to work through what often are communication barriers to understanding between team members. Those of us who work in special education, we are very familiar with this language. But for parents who maybe this is their first IEP meeting or their only child that they've ever had on an IEP and receiving special education services, this is a whole new language that they're learning and a whole new world that they're entering. And so it's not only important that we listen to one another, but that we hear one another. We might be talking about the same goals for a student, but using different language. And so again, if we can come to the table understanding that we're all here for the student's best interest, if we can slow things down a little bit where we can make space to ask questions and clarify any confusion in communication, oftentimes we are all going to reach a resolution that we feel confident in. And so many times that is the biggest role that I play as an advocate, is a bit of a translator, say taking what the confusing and difficult language that we might be using in evaluations and things like that, and breaking it down so that an overwhelmed parent can understand it. Okay. And so resources. Where do you go when you are having issues with your child's IEP or with your child's IEP team? Obviously, our hope is that everybody has a really positive IEP and special education experience. And that is certainly always the lens that I work from, is that I am trying to help either mend the relationship between a school and a family. I am trying to help build a relationship between a school and a family. Especially if kiddos are young and they're going to be in this district a long time. We want to make sure that we have that solid foundation to work from. But that doesn't mean that issues don't come up. And so when they do, it's really important that you know where do you go to ask for help. And so if your student is already on an IEP, you always want to start with the child's case manager. Typically, it's going to be their special education teacher, but it might not be. And so you'll find who that case manager is listed on typically the front page or the back side of the front page of the IEP. That's where you want to start. And that's going to be your primary line of communication. Not only is that person going to be the person who spends the most time with your student, likely, but it's also the person who is managing all of the data. So that is the person that you want to have the most communication with. And a lot of times, the biggest issue I see in IEPs is a lack of communication, or the perception of a lack of communication. It's really hard to hand over your kiddo, especially perhaps a non-speaking kiddo or a really young kiddo, or somebody who maybe isn't great at being able to advocate for themselves. It can be really hard to hand them over to somebody else and trust that they are safe and well taken care of, no matter how well-intentioned that other person is. I think that's just a natural part of parenting. And so oftentimes parents are looking for more communication from about the day-to-day happenings than they're receiving. And it's a balancing act, because we also have to understand that your child's case manager is working with a number of other students also who are also requesting communication and things like that. So I like to advise families to set up a communication plan with the school that feels good for everybody involved. And so again, that's going to be really individualized. Maybe it means that you and the child's teacher send text messages back and forth to each other. Maybe it means that you send a summary email at the end of the week or every couple of weeks. Maybe it means that your student has a notebook that they go back and forth between the classroom and home with, that you and the teacher write notes about, or important information that you think each other need to know in order to work well together. So-and-so missed their meds this morning and might be cranky, or so-and-so had a really rough night last night and may be more dysregulated today than they were yesterday. So-and-so had a fight with their best friend on the playground and may be really upset about it when they come home. That kind of informal communication. So I always encourage you to find a style of communication with your child's teacher that feels sustainable for everybody involved. However, if you're feeling like you need more support than what you can receive from your child's case manager, the next step would be to contact your district coordinator. There are district coordinators for both the Thompson Valley system and the Poudre School District, and those coordinators oversee the feeder systems into the different high schools. So the best way to find out who your district coordinator is to find out which high school can we expect your student to attend based on your feeder system, okay? And reach out to them. Of course, you can always reach out to us here at the ARC, and we have several different avenues for receiving advocacy here. The first is requesting ongoing advocacy. And the way that you can do that is by visiting our website and clicking the Request Advocacy button. That will give you a page to fill out to the best of your ability with who you're requesting advocacy for, what the nature of the concern is, the best way to contact you, and so forth. And that really gives us an opportunity to connect you with an advocate that is going to be working ongoing with you. And when I say ongoing, again, it's very individualized. It might be, I have families that I work nearly every day with if we're working through a really complex situation. But I also have families that I maybe hear from once a year when it's time for that annual IEP and they'd like some support at the meeting. There is no maximum or minimum amount of time that you need to spend with an advocate in order to use our services. We are here for you when you need us. We also have what's called our walk-in hours. Right now they are our call-in hours during COVID, but those are every Wednesday morning from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. And these are for really sort of one-time quick questions that don't necessarily need ongoing support. These might be questions about a Social Security application or reviewing an IEP request letter or a quick question about an IEP goal. Again, things that you don't feel like you necessarily need ongoing advocacy support for. And so you're able to call in during that 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. time, and whichever advocate is on call will be able to assist you. And again, if we determine during that walk-in time that you would be better suited for ongoing advocacy, we'll go ahead and get you started with ongoing advocacy then as well. Another option that we have that we just started in the last few months are our Parent Hour support groups. We are meeting right now, Patrick, please correct me if I'm wrong, once a month. And the purpose of these really is to focus on support for parents. Typically, we will have a guest speaker from the community who will come in and speak about certain topics, such as managing difficult behaviors at home, or components of a successful IEP meeting, things like that. And then the rest of the time is really designed for parents to support each other and share their common experiences of raising children with disabilities, dealing with these different systems that can often be confusing and overwhelming, and really find that support, especially right now during COVID, where I think we can feel more isolated from each other more than ever. And you can find out more about these support groups either on our Facebook page, ARC of Larimer County, or on our website. And then
Melissa,
yes.
Sorry if I could just jump in. Yes, you are correct. They meet once a month, and I think if anybody on here knows parents that are interested, probably the best way to register is through our website. But thanks for bringing that up, and sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, and then the last option is the Colorado Department of Education Alternative Dispute Resolution. This is also a free service, and their purpose is to be an impartial facilitator for IEP teams. So if you are really having a difficult time reaching a consensus, or there's really a lot of disagreement amongst the team, you can request a facilitator from this alternative dispute resolution process. And again, their purpose is to really help solve issues before they rise to the level of needing to file a state complaint or go through due process. Again, it's really intended to solve the situation here and now, because unfortunately, if we do have to file a state complaint or go through due process, ultimately those are very long processes, and we're not necessarily meeting the students' needs right now. And so the sooner we can solve the problem that we're experiencing, the better. And so you can visit the Colorado Department of Education website, and they also have an intake form there for the Alternative Dispute Resolution Department. They are facilitating IEP meetings right now remotely during COVID. I've worked with them throughout the pandemic. And then once folks are back in schools and buildings, they are also able to attend in person as well. So those are a few places where you can start if you are feeling overwhelmed or as if you need more support. And that's all I have as far as our presentation goes. So now I would like to open it up to anybody that has questions or comments or concerns.
Hi, thank you. I don't have any questions. That was really informative. And I appreciate all the information. And so thank you.
Great, thank you.
And I think Joe had to hop off, but I think it's okay to go ahead and end if that's all you have.
Great. Well, thank you so much for attending today. I hope this information was informative. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out through our website or through email. And this will be posted in the next few days on our website. So thank you so much, everybody.